Dear participants, dear Professor Gerard Steen, welcome to our İzmir Linguistic Circle Talks number 99 today. We thank you for your participation. Just a brief introduction for Mr. Gerard Steen. He is an emeritus professor now at University of Amsterdam. He was the director of Metaphor Lab for research on metaphors in Amsterdam also. And we have met in 2011, I think, with Metaphor Winter School. And I follow his studies closely. And he have lots of studies on metaphors, and he had a theory on metaphors, deliberate metaphor theory. He's a well-known professor, researcher at the field. So after this brief introduction, I leave the word for Professor Steen.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Can you stick up your thumb? Okay, great. Okay, it's a great pleasure to give this talk in the first week or the second week of the new year. And I have decided to give a little bit of an overview of what I have done in the past couple of years to show you how the theory of metaphor that I've developed has consequences for analyzing metaphor in language use. So I'm going to take you through it step by step. I'm not going to show you all of the technical details, but at the end, I'm going to give you a reference to a recent article, which also has a connection to a database where you can look at all the details. And I invite you to take a look at that after the talk. And if you have any questions or comments, you can always write to me at my academic address, which is now not on this site, but I think it was on the invitation. So here's the plan of the talk. In the first section, I would like to talk about the reason for developing a new theory. And that reason I described in an article that I published in 2008, which is called The Paradox of Metaphor. And I now add from CMT to DMT, because basically what I'm trying to do is move beyond the work by Lakoff and Johnson and many cognitive linguists. They have developed conceptual metaphor theory. And I think that that is a very useful theory, and it has produced a lot of useful research, but I think it's not enough. And I think that we need to look at other aspects of metaphor in language use and in discourse to understand completely what is happening. And for that purpose, I have developed deliberate metaphor theory, which I abbreviate here as DMT. So I'm going to introduce that in the first part of the talk. The second part of the talk is basically a very brief, not even overview, but simply a description of what DMT tries to do and what DMT has become over the past 10, 15 years. So I call it from DMT 1.0 to DMT 2.0, and that is basically all of that has been described in my new book, which I refer to there, and in an article which is available for free online. So I will give references to that as well. And then finally, all of this new work led to something which I think is an important new insight about metaphor in use, and that is that I think that a lot of metaphor is ambiguous in its use. And a lot of metaphor can be used in two ways. It can be used or understood metaphorically and non-metaphorically. And I'll try to explain what that means when we get there. And then finally, I have a brief conclusion. So let's take the bull by the horns and immediately proceed to what I call the paradox of metaphor. I'll begin with metaphor in language and thought, which was, of course, the basic discovery by Lakoff and Johnson and many other cognitive linguists that metaphor is not just a matter of language or language use, but that it is more fundamental for cognition and actually may form one of the foundations of all of our thinking. And so this was the basis for the rise of conceptual metaphor theory since 1980. And this is basically an elaboration of the idea that metaphor is understanding one domain of experience in terms of another domain of experience. And of course, we have a couple of examples there. And so here's one set of examples. If you talk about anger, you often talk about it in terms of fire. And so here's a set of examples from a paper by Zoltan Kovacs, who's one of the most prominent conceptual linguists who talks about metaphor. That kindled my ire. Those were inflammatory remarks. Smoke was coming out of his ears. She was burning with anger. He was spitting fire, and the incident set the people ablaze with anger. So these are examples from this article called Conceptual Metaphor Theory in Elena Semino and Sofia Demjen's Routledge Handbook of Metaphor and Language. It's the first article in the book, and this signals how important this starting point for most metaphor people has become. I take it that I don't have to explain how this works, and that most of you know what this is supposed to illustrate. Basically, what you can see is that all of the words in italics are words that come from fire, from the domain, the conceptual domain of fire, and that they are used to talk about being angry. And there's nothing special or strange about this. The whole point of conceptual metaphor theory is that lots of these expressions come from our conceptualization of anger by means of fire. And as a result of that, we also use linguistic expressions that illustrate this. And this is a very powerful approach that can explain, for instance, that the cause of anger is actually thought about in terms of the cause of fire. And the idea that something can cause anger can also cause the fire. An angry person is the thing on fire. The fire corresponds with the anger, and the intensity of the fire corresponds with the intensity of the anger. And so this is an explanation of language structures in terms of conceptual structures. And that is, of course, the basis of conceptual metaphor theory. The assumption is that we have lots of conceptual metaphors in our thinking that help us to conceive what is happening in reality and in the world. And so, again, this is all very familiar to anyone who has read a little bit about metaphor. And I hope that this may suffice at this moment to introduce the starting point of modern metaphor theory and metaphor research, which tries to uncover many of these semantic and cognitive relations between different domains of experience, and then tries to see how they are expressed in language. However, there's a problem with this approach, and in order to explain that, I first of all need to say, when we talk about metaphor in language and thought, as we just did, we basically conceptualize metaphor as part of our conceptuals, as thought as our conceptual system, and metaphor in language as our linguistic system. And why are these systems? Well, for instance, this is what you have to learn as a foreign language learner. If I were to learn Turkish, I would have to know which words were related in which ways to which meanings, and that is the language system in terms of vocabulary. And this is supposed to reflect the structures of thought as a conceptual system, which is stable and shared between lots of people. When these two systems are used, so the conceptual system and the language system, they make it possible to produce and receive utterances. And so you need parts of the system to build expressions that can function in utterances. And that is why these systems are so important. And these utterances are basically instruments with which people interact, whether it's spoken or written, doesn't matter. So that is the well-known opposition, as it were, between language's system and language's use. And this has been very important in linguistics. Chomsky had competence and performance, even Saussure had langue and parole. And so there are always variations on this theme. There's basically the systems are abstractions from moments of use. And moments of use involve production processes and reception processes. And that basically is psychology and social processes. Use cannot be studied without also bringing in psychology and without also bringing in what we know about social processes between people. So again, this is making clear some of the assumptions that I think most metaphor scholars would support. But, and this is the problem, when you look closely, not every metaphor in language and thought as systems, or language and thought as use in these expressions, require using a cross-domain mapping in psychological processing. So the little examples that I gave before, they illustrate metaphor in language and thought as system and use. But when we then try to test that by going to what people do in their behavior, in their minds, it turns out that not every metaphor requires doing a cross-domain mapping. Actually, many metaphors may not be processed as a metaphor by doing a cross-domain mapping at all. And this basically generates a paradox of metaphor, because it means that most metaphors are not processed or comprehended metaphorically by doing a cross-domain mapping. They are comprehended in a different way. Let me try to explain that. The problem is caused because most metaphor that we now recognize as metaphor as linguists is based in polysemy. And what does that mean? If we look at the examples we just had, that kindled my ire, if you go to the dictionary and look up the word kindle, it has two meanings. It has an emotional meaning and it has a fire meaning. And they are both completely conventional. And so this is called polysemy, because it means that one term can mean two things, and the one sense or the one meaning is motivated by the other one via metaphor. So the emotional sense, kindled, is motivated by the fire sense of kindled. The point is that most of these words may be processed by lexical disambiguation. And what is lexical disambiguation? If you hear the word bank, or if you read the word bank, you have to actually disambiguate between the financial thing and the river thing. Okay, so the word bank can mean two things. You have to disambiguate the word, the lexeme, to get the right meaning, to understand the utterance that you're talking about, that you're listening to. And so you don't immediately have to do any sort of relation between those two words. You can simply pick the most relevant one. And this also holds for metaphor. Most of these metaphors can be immediately disambiguated. You can immediately go to in this case, kindle, the emotion sense, not the fire sense, and you're right there. Those were inflammatory remarks. The word inflammatory has two senses in the dictionary. Suppose that you have a mental dictionary that is the same as the written dictionary. Two senses get automatically activated, and then you throw one away and you keep the other one. But you don't have to do a cross-domain mapping to get from the one to the other, because they are both simply there, available from the start. He was burning with anger. Burning has the same situation. Burn has two senses. It has more senses, but it has at least two senses. They are both activated automatically. You pick the one that is relevant, and you get the emotion meaning without doing the cross-domain mapping. He was spitting fire. Spit has an emotion sense. You don't have to go through a fire sense, and basically, actually, spit doesn't have a fire sense. It only gets a fire sense in this context. So there's a few problems in doing this, and that's why the third example is in red. If you go to a dictionary, smoke was coming out of his ears. If you go to the Webster, this is not something that you immediately see as a conventionalized meaning. Suppose Webster was your mental dictionary, then you wouldn't have a conventional meaning. So there may be questions about this even from the start. But let's ignore them for the moment. The incident set the people ablaze with anger. Again, ablaze is polysemous. It needs lexical disambiguation, and you simply have to choose between the relevant emotion sense or the relevant fire sense. And the whole point of cognitive linguistics has been to emphasize the fire sense in this case, and to say that it is always produced in your mind by going first to the source domain sense, fire, and then projecting the target domain sense, emotion, from that source domain sense. As I'm saying, this is not supported by all linguists. There are other theories based on experimental research that say the same as that I am now saying. Actually, it's the other way around. I have collected that evidence and drawn the conclusion that there are quite a few theories that say maybe not all metaphor is processed metaphorically, but I have drawn the conclusion where I say, if that is the case, we have a really big problem. We have a paradox of metaphor. Here are the other theories. There is Sam Glucksberg's class inclusion theory, Baudel and Gentner's career of metaphor theory. They emphasize that metaphors may start out as real metaphors from the beginning, but then they may get so conventionalized that they become polysemous, and because of that, they get a different process. They are not processed by comparison, but they are processed by immediate lexical disambiguation. The same holds for Rachel Giora's graded salience hypothesis, and all of this is compatible with Sperber and Wilson's relevance theory. And if you want to look this up, you can go to Raymond Gibbs's Cambridge Handbook of Metaphor and Thought, where all of these four theories can be found in the first part of the handbook, and you can look up how these people come to these conclusions. So basically, this is what I put forward in 2008. There's a big problem, and we need to solve it. Namely, metaphor may be there in the structure of language and thought, both in system and use, but in processing, it may actually not be there all the time, or a lot of the time. So that produces this paradox. How do we resolve it? I put forward a 3D model in that 2008 article, where I say metaphor is not just a matter of language and thought, but it is also a matter of communication. And this means that we're talking about the specific use of a metaphor as a metaphor between people. We have the little sentences that we had at the beginning, but they actually may be used as a metaphor or not. And when they are used as a metaphor, they require metaphorical processing and cross-domain mapping. But when they are not used as a metaphor, they may actually work via simple lexical disambiguation. So this is use, and this is really use, and it applies to either production or reception in interaction. Okay, so it reveals another dimension of metaphor next to metaphor in language and metaphor in thought, namely metaphor in communication, where the use of a metaphor is either meant to be metaphorical, so deliberate, or not meant to be metaphorical, so non-deliberate. My favorite example here is when I say that we are now in 2025. In is metaphorical in language, it's metaphorical in thought, but I don't want you to go to space in order to derive a temporal meaning. It's simply there in your mental dictionary, and you're just supposed to use it. So I don't mean that metaphor to be used as a metaphor. Okay, so as soon as you accept that, you realize that metaphor actually has a number of dimensions that are all there at the same time. Metaphor is thought where it can be a novel mapping or a conventional mapping. Metaphor is language where it can be, for instance, a simile or a metaphor, where it's so that it's signaled or non-signaled. But separately from that, there's also the communicative dimension, where metaphor can be used as a metaphor, where the same metaphor can be used as a metaphor or not as a metaphor. So we have here a three-dimensional model for metaphor analysis. And this basically means even in this simple story, this means that we have every metaphor makes a choice between signaled or not signaled, so simile or metaphor. It makes a choice between being novel or conventional, so the same signaled versus non-signaled metaphor may be either expressed as a metaphor or as a simile, and it may be used deliberately or not deliberately as a metaphor. So that creates a configuration of 2 by 2 by 2 makes 8 possible configurations of the structure of metaphor. And this is already quite a difficult analytical task. And in the past 10 years, lots of people have tried to show how this works in practice by showing that metaphors actually do belong to these different categories and exhibit these different configurations. The view that I formulated there also prompted a reinterpretation of experimental research. So, for instance, novel metaphor, the conceptual dimension, is also deliberate. Because if I say science is a glacier or science is like a glacier, it's clear that there's not a conventionally available sense for glacier yet, and that we have to do the mapping from glaciers to science, and that is a deliberate meaning of that utterance. Well, a lot of conventional metaphor is not deliberate. And so the research by Glucksberg and by Gentner and Baudel and by Giora actually, without knowing it, also looked at deliberate versus non-deliberate metaphor, but they only contrasted conventional versus novel or signaled versus non-signaled, so simile versus metaphor. So to me, you can actually use that research to also talk about how deliberate versus non-deliberate metaphor behaves. And then there's, of course, the even more specific three-way configurations that have even more complex combinations of all of these values. This led to, when we did this, we actually started on new corpus research, and my former PhD student Gudrun Reiniers she had a project called The Value of Deliberate Metaphor, and she looked at how these various specific structural configurations were distributed across word classes and were used for different purposes. And we also developed a deliberate metaphor identification procedure. And we showed that the deliberate metaphor use can be reliably distinguished from non-deliberate metaphor use if you follow a particular procedure that Gudrun published in this first article. At the bottom, DMIP, a method for identifying potentially deliberate metaphor in language use in corpus pragmatics. This is publicly available. Okay, so the idea in 2008 led to new research, which was then followed up by lots of other people as well. And the consequence of this is that all metaphor use that is analyzed as potentially deliberate, so for instance, all simile or all novel metaphor, is also predicted to generate analogical processing, because we must do something like that to understand science is a glacier. We have to make an analogy between glaciers and science to understand what that utterance intends to say. You cannot do that without projecting an analogy. And this may even be elaborated into a more encompassing cross-domain mapping. It's not just a local analogy, but you can actually do a more extensive cross-domain mapping and bring in more knowledge about the different domains. All metaphor use that is analyzed as non-deliberate is predicted to bypass analogical processing during comprehension. simply because it may directly be comprehended via lexical disambiguation. And so the examples I gave at the beginning, he's burning with fire, you don't need to do that cross-domain mapping. You can simply do the lexical disambiguation. And because of that, you do not experience a metaphor either, even though the language structures and the conceptual structures are based in metaphor. But that may be a matter of history, of the development of thinking and development of the language system. As a result, it is not metaphor in thought, but metaphor in communication that is the crux of the studies that target metaphor in language use. With this starting point, all metaphor in language use that counts as metaphor when the utterance is analyzed as communication is also processed metaphorically. So science is a glacier, or science is like a glacier. You can analyze this as a metaphor in communication, where the sender asks the addressee to do a metaphor, to do metaphorical thinking. And this is analysis, but you can also see that this is required in processing. This is the big hypothesis. And that would actually resolve the paradox of metaphor, because metaphor in communication then is metaphor, whereas previously it was metaphor in thought is metaphor. And so I think that this is a change in perspective. So this led to a lot of research over the past 15 years. It started with the 2008 article, but I have now just published this new book, Slowing Metaphor Down, Elaborating Deliberate Metaphor Theory, where I bring together the research that, in as much as I could bring it together. And it shows that indeed deliberate metaphor theory has a lot to say according to this new framework. Since not everybody can afford a book that costs $110, this is the publishing world, I have also summarized kind of the main ideas in an article that is available from Frontiers in Psychology, that is online. And if you just type in the title of the article, Thinking by Metaphor Fast and Slow, then you will immediately get it online and you can use it and you can see the most important points of what has happened to deliberate metaphor theory over the past 15 years. And it has lots of references. And I think it's a nice introduction to the book. And if you get interested, then you can always try and see if you can get the book through the library, for instance. So something has happened in those 15 years. It would be strange if nothing happened and if there weren't any changes. And so there was a lot of theoretical and methodological and empirical research. And this has led to a further elaboration of the model from 3 dimensions to 4 dimensions. And why do we need 4 dimensions? Because I have now made more explicit that deliberate metaphor theory is framed in a more general model of all utterance comprehension, which is called the construction integration model. And this started in the late 70s, early 80s by Teun van Dijk and Walter Kinch. And they have a model that yields 4 dimensions for all utterance comprehension. They basically say that when we comprehend an utterance, we build mental representations of 4 different kinds. And of course, this should also apply to utterance comprehension that includes metaphor use. So basically, this adds 1 more dimension to metaphor analysis in utterances. Basically, we go from metaphor in language and in thought and in communication, as I proposed in 2008, to distinguishing a 4th dimension where metaphor should be analyzed in terms of reference to some world. And if you think about it, every utterance that basically is exchanged between people, whether it's in writing or in talking, exhibits these 4 dimensions. There's language, there's thinking of the 2 people, there's communication between the 2 people, and all of this is somehow related to either the real world around them or to some world that they are imagining or remembering or whatever. And so this is a general desideratum for all language analysis, and it should also take care of metaphor. The 4 dimensions are as follows. First of all, when you look at the language aspect of any utterance, this has to be analyzed in order to build what Van Dijk and Kinch call the surface text. You have to have a mental representation of the surface text before you can get to the thought and the world and the communication. If I hear you guys speak Turkish, I will not be able to even build this in the I will not be able to build a surface text because unfortunately I don't speak Turkish. Once you have a surface text, once you have the linguistic expression analyzed, you can derive a conceptual structure. And so you can see which words activate which concepts and how they relate to each other. And this produces what is called a text base. And it gives you basically the ideas that are expressed in the text by the language. And this is the level at which most cognitive linguists look at metaphor and how it should be analyzed. Thirdly, those words and concepts are not there hanging in the air. They are supposed to be related to some sort of situation in the real world, or in an imagined world, or in a fictional world. And so there should also be an account of which reference, with a TS, the words and the concepts put into a mini situation model. And finally, you have to build a mental representation of what the speaker wants to do with that representation of the situation model. Does he want to declare it? Does he want to negate it? Do they want to use it for persuasive purposes, and so on? And that is a context model that talks about the role of the utterance in the communication between the people. So if I go and apply this to the examples in conceptual metaphor theory, in comprehension, each of these examples that I got from Kovetches should contribute to building a surface text where they represent the language aspects, a text base where they represent the conceptual aspects, a situation model where they represent the reference to the world, and a context model where they represent communication. So for kindled my ire, you need to understand that it is a verb with a number of meanings from your mental dictionary. That is the language, and that is part of the surface text. Then you access the corresponding concept for kindle to produce the text base. You go to the situation model and decide which referent is in the situation that is related to the word and the concept. And finally, you wonder what the purpose of the sender is, or how the receiver can actually attribute an intention to the sender. And so this also goes for inflammatory, and it also goes for smoke was coming out of his ears. Each of these words, and also the other words, of course, need this four-dimensional analysis. What DMT does is it predicts the content of each of these four mental models for the metaphorically used words, and also for the other words, but specifically for the metaphor-related words. And the crux of this whole approach is that in comprehension, part of this analysis aims at establishing whether the use of, let me see what's happening here, metaphor in the utterance was intended to work as a metaphor in communication or not. And so if we go back here, what the analysis aims to show is that kindled my ire. Was it meant to make the receiver think about anger in terms of fire, or was it not? Okay. And that is part of the context model. You can represent that in the mental model that is called context model. And this goes for kindled, for inflammatory. Do you think that inflammatory was used to make the receiver of this particular utterance think of anger in terms of fire? In effect, this means when you ask this question, you also ask another question implicitly. Does the sender actually send you to the domain of fire and look at anger from that perspective? That is precisely the function of metaphor, of course, to produce an alien perspective upon the target domain via the source domain referent. And so, does it put that referent into the situation or not? Again, same examples. The problem is we do not go around making this kind of figurative comparison in language use all the time. I don't think that you are aware that you have done lots and lots of these comparisons in the past hours, while at the same time, 1 in 8 words is a metaphor. And so there is a big difference between the metaphors in language and thought on the one hand, and how they function as reference and as the expression of intentions on the other. Most metaphors in language use are not meant to work as metaphors in this way. That is my claim. And this explains the paradox of metaphor. Okay, last step of the talk. I want to show this in detail to you with one example. And this is taken from an article that I will reference at the bottom of this slide. If you look at the word parasite in the Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English, it gives you the following information. Parasite is related to the topics of animals and plants and biology, which seems natural. Parasite is a noun, it's countable, and then it means either a plant or animal that lives on or in another plant or animal and gets food from it. Again, no surprise, but what do we get as a second sense? Informally, you can use parasite to indicate a lazy person who does not work but depends on other people. And this is used to show approval. And this is from an article by Andreas Musov. In the dictionary, you get the following examples from a corpus. They tend to regard people on welfare as parasites. Most government employees had become parasites, expecting to retain their positions through friendship or political favor. It will probably resist extermination since, unlike its parasites, it frequents shallow water. You shouldn't feel sorry for these people, they're just parasites. The end product of such a course of evolution is an obligate parasite that is inextricably linked to a particular host. Screening for the parasite should be part of the investigative procedures in children with chronic diarrhea, and the benefit for the gatherers, the parasites of the system, is self-evident. What is striking is that examples 1 and 2 are not the animal domain, but the people domain. The third is the animal domain. The fourth is the people domain. And the fifth and the sixth are the animal domain again. And the seventh may need a little more context to make a decision. But as you can see, the word parasite is just as easily used to talk about people in a negative way as it is used to talk about little minuscule animals. Let us take a close look at what is happening in the first example. They tend to regard people on welfare as parasites. Basically, the senses that the Longman Dictionary gives is that you can actually choose between 2 alternative referents in the situation depicted by the utterance. First of all, the utterance may mean to say they tend to regard people on welfare as plants or animals that live on or in another plant or animal and get food from it. Or, in other words, parasite as a little animal. They tend to regard people on welfare as parasites in the biological sense. Okay? The same sentence may also mean they tend to regard people on welfare as lazy persons, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So what I'm saying is that because we have the word parasite and because parasite has 2 meanings, we do not know what the sender meant to give to the recipient in terms of the situation model. Both meanings are possible and plausible. Again, they tend to regard people on welfare as plants. That's a genuine metaphor, and that can be meant, it's possible, and it's plausible. But it can also be they tend to regard people on welfare as lazy persons. That is possible and plausible, but a totally different meaning of this particular utterance. The A meaning is deliberately metaphorical, where the sender deliberately means to talk about people in terms of plants. And the B sentence is non-deliberately metaphorical, where the sender uses words from the animal domain to talk about people, but he doesn't want you to make a comparison because the intended meaning is already there. Okay, so that is non-deliberately, but still metaphorical. This distinction is based in two related aspects of meaning of the utterance. We have a different reference, namely people versus animals, and different intentions, namely do a metaphor or don't do a metaphor. While the basis of metaphorical meaning resides in the polysemy of parasite, identical language and identical thought for both meanings. If you compare this to other figurative uses, there were two other examples there. Most government employees had become parasites. Can we do the same thing? Yes, we can interpret it as talking about plants or animals that live on or in another plant or animal. That would be a bona fide interpretation of that sentence. Or lazy persons who do not work. Again, that would be the intended metaphorical meaning. Again, this sentence is ambiguous. Same thing for you shouldn't feel sorry for these people. They're just parasites. I will speed up because I see I'm running out of time, but we started a little late. If we go to the non-figurative use, we will see the examples like it will probably exist extermination. Unlike its parasites, it frequents shallow water. Again, we have the two senses that we have to choose between. And of course, we now clearly have only one choice that we can go on, namely, we're talking about plants. We're not talking about lazy persons. Okay, so the non-figurative use clearly is not ambiguous, whereas the figurative use here is ambiguous between deliberately metaphorical and not deliberately metaphorical. Most metaphor is based in polysemy. This is the whole strong point of cognitive linguistics. Actually, we've done corpus work, and that shows that 95%, if not more, of metaphor in language use is polysemous. It displays an indirect relation to the target domain. This type of metaphor in language use is structurally ambiguous between metaphorical and non-metaphorical meaning. Are we talking about parasite in the biological meaning or parasite in the lazy person meaning? That is not clear immediately. And so this makes it possible to use that same expression in two different ways, one of which is non-deliberate and another is deliberate. Okay, so whereas the first point of deliberate metaphor theory was, hey, we need to add a different dimension. The second is a lot of metaphor may actually be not clear between whether it was meant to be metaphorical or not. Conclusion. I have 3 more slides and then we're done. Polysemy has consequences for processing. The use of a metaphor-related word that is based in polysemy first needs lexical disambiguation. And this happens for all words that are polysemous, like the word bank, and there's many others. If the word is metaphor-related and the source domain sense is preferred, so the biological sense for parasites, then the situation model has an animal there where we're talking about people, and we need analogy to project the animal sense onto the people domain. This is deliberate metaphor use. If the target domain sense is preferred, like lazy person, then the situation model does not need analogy because we're talking about people in terms of people, and there's no incoherence. Okay, and this is non-deliberate metaphor use. So non-deliberate or deliberate metaphor use is enabled by structure, but in most cases, what happens in reality, it is actually a matter of use. So which decision does the sender or the comprehender make? consequences for metaphor analysis in language use. We need to always see what the language of a metaphor looks like, and that is in order to predict the content of the surface text in comprehension. So we're talking there about metaphor identification. Then we need to relate that to concepts and build the text base. Then we need to go to the situation model and we turn the concepts into reference. And as you can see, disambiguation then requires either looking at a coherent situation where we talk about people as lazy persons, only target domain, no analogy needed, but it's also possible that the utterance actually, when it is disambiguated, leads to an incoherent situation where people are talked about in terms of, let us say, biological parasites. That is a source domain, and it needs to be connected to the target domain by analogy. Otherwise, we don't know why it was used and how it was used. Both of these scenarios, coherent situation versus incoherent situation, are related to no intention to do a metaphor versus intention to do a metaphor. And that has to be represented in the context model of either of both the sender's mind and the recipient's mind. All metaphors require this multidimensional analysis because they are all part of the four mental representations of discourse, and most metaphors require this affordance for ambiguous analysis because most metaphors are polysemous, and so we have to allow for two different ways that the metaphor is understood. So if you want to see how this works in practice and in detail, you should go to this particular article that I have in Metaphor and Symbol, which was just published in October of last year, The Ambiguity of Metaphor. If you, again, type in the title, you will get access to the journal and it will give you the text. I also included it in the invitation for this talk. And so please take a look at that, and then you see much more detailed reasoning for how this works. And what is linked to this article is an OSF, Open Science Framework site with data analysis. And you can have, it's public, you can go there and you can see how for different metaphors the analysis actually goes. Finally, this means that the original prediction was that we have a paradox of metaphor. I still believe that that is the case for people who do not go beyond language and thought. We add intentions and later we differentiate out the role of reference. And there's a new prediction that follows from that, the ambiguity of metaphor, which starts from structures but moves into use because ambiguity of metaphor enables multivalent use, and it basically offers a new prediction in that way, which explains and includes the original prediction of the paradox of metaphor. So that is why this research is quite coherent and the result of one framework. Last slide. Basically, we're looking at the role of language structures and psychological processes in social interaction. And DMT aims to describe the interaction between metaphor as structure, so the way we now analyze these utterances, and metaphor as process in language use, so the way the psychologists have looked at all this in a wide range of discourse situations. And this can also provide a comprehensive account of resistance to metaphor. So people talking about cancer in terms of a war, how would they ever talk about the fact that war language is inappropriate if they were not able to discriminate between genuine metaphor and non-deliberate metaphor? I think that's it for now, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
We thank you, dear professor, and we are accepting questions now. You may raise your hand from the...
And I realize that there's a lot in this talk, so there are no dumb questions.
You may open your mics and just ask any question if you want. or you can write. No questions. I think they're trying to absorb all the information you have given. I have a question, Professor.
Okay.
For deliberate metaphors, is there any markers that leads to metaphors, or you have hints, linguistic hints and linguistic tips for deliberate metaphor?
So my favorite example is the first line of Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
Okay.
Okay, so the word compare there suggests that Shakespeare wants to compare the lover to a summer's day. And that is a clear sign that he wants the metaphor to be understood as a metaphor. Okay. Basically, on similar lines, there's a lot of rock songs that have this, of course. And so, for instance, Neil Young has a song which has a line, "You are like a hurricane." Okay, that clearly is meant as a deliberately as a metaphor, and we are supposed to take it as a metaphor. What he wants is that you compare the lover to a hurricane. Okay, so there are, suppose you are in a therapy and your counselor says to you, imagine your relationship as a dance, or imagine your relationship as a war. And so there are many signals that suggest that you are supposed to connect two domains of thinking, but also of reference, in order to understand the target domain in terms of the source domain. Okay, so most similes, most comparisons, extended comparisons, analogies, not every analogy is metaphorical. If I say that Istanbul is to Turkey like Amsterdam is to Holland, that's an analogy that is not metaphorical. But if I say Istanbul is to Turkey as the head is to the body, that is a metaphorical analogy. Okay, so you can make analogies explicit in this way. And so then there are clear linguistic signals then in the utterance that encourage people to do metaphorical thinking.
Okay, thank you very much. This may be a good research question for finding the linguistic markers of deliberate metaphor. Maybe on a corpus, on a large scale corpus.
There is stuff about that. If you look at the bibliography of the book, there's quite a few articles there already by people. And so I think it's interesting to see how this works for different languages.
Might be in poems, different poems could be.
Right, totally. Yes. Yeah. And there's, of course, a lot of deliberate metaphor that is not signaled.
Yes.
And so there's a famous poem by Robert Frost, to talk about poetry. Robert Frost has a poem that is called The Road Not Taken. And he talks about how he thinks about how he is in a forest and took one road but did not take the other road, and how that made all the difference in his life. Clearly, that is metaphorical. It's not just about a walk in the woods, okay? And you're supposed to take the source domain scenario of the walk in the woods as projecting structure onto how we live our life and make choices. And that is less signaled, as it were, by explicit linguistic markers.
Yes, literature has lots of implicit and deliberate metaphors.
Totally, yeah.
Robert Frost is an allegory of choices.
Precisely. Yeah,
Similarly,
the Pilgrim's Progress,
yes.
you know.
similarly, we have Aşık Veysel is a folk poet, and he has a work. I'm walking a long thin road. It's about life from the start and to the end. So it's a implicit, deliberate metaphor. He talks about walking a road, but it's life itself. It's not the road.
Yeah.
So life is a journey. It's a conceptual metaphor.
Totally, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? I think not at the moment, but my students will get me with lots of students, lots of questions, and maybe I will share it with you.
Happy to look at them, definitely.
Okay, thank you for participating to our speech, Professor Steen, and for
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me to do this, and I hope that people at least have got the bigger part of the story here, because I realize it's been a lot, so I hope that it wasn't too much.
I think they will absorb and they will understand, because there are my PhD students next semester will do a course in cognitive linguistics, and I think your presentation is a good start for them. I think it's a motivating start for them.
That's great. I'm getting some nice thank yous through the chat. So
Yeah.
Sorry for
thank you very
interruption.
much.
There is a question in the chat box. Have
Is
you
there?
seen?
I don't
There
think
is a
so.
question.
I didn't.
I can read.
Oh, here, yes. Roman
Roman
Jakobson says that poems are the most beautiful representation of language, linguistics. Do I agree? In a way, yes. I think that actually I love Roman Jakobson's work, and I think it's been extremely important. So my 4 dimensions can even be related to his 6-dimensional model without a problem. And I just use the 4-dimensional model because that's a psychological model which has been tested experimentally, but it's totally compatible with what Jakobson says. And yes, I think that poetry plays with language in a way that makes people aware of what words can do in a way that most other, and it's not just poetry, it's also pop songs, and even in advertisements, there's lots of examples there where you can see language play in a way that is almost poetic. And then there's another one. Can we also speak of linguistic metaphor when it comes to idioms? Yes, very much. Actually, a lot of metaphor research started via looking at idioms and checking the metaphorical motivation for idioms. So even the example that Kovetches gave about the smoke coming out of his ears, that's almost an idiom. And so you have a little scenario there, but there's been lots of research in the 80s, especially by psycholinguists who want to examine whether people actually make a metaphorical scenario and then go to the literal meaning or not. Okay. I think those were the questions that I can see.
Yes, those are the questions, I think.
Good.
Okay. Okay, we can finish. It's 1 hour and it's been a very fruitful 1 hour. Thank you again for your participation. For
meeting you guys.
Thanks a lot.
It was very nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See
See you later.
Have a good evening.
You have to also.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.